Good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everyone who has joined us today. I am Malari Veerappan, the Report Manager for the World Development Report 2021, Data for Better Lives. Most of my experience has been working on large enterprise data projects or data systems at the intersection of data governance, data management, and technology. So this year's WDR on data is particularly close to my heart. By now, many of you may have already heard several discourses on the potential of data to improve or harm lives. To address this tension between the harmful and helpful potential of data, the WDR 2021 calls for a new social contract that enables use and reuse of data to create economic and social value, ensures equitable access to that value, and fosters trust that data will not be misused in harmful ways. But how do we negotiate such a social contract in practice, especially as the digital economy has expanded globally? An increasingly complex and geographically diverse group of stakeholders have become active in the data system. And decisions about how data are managed, produced, and used is no longer the responsibility of a few stakeholders. So in this report, we argue that a multi-stakeholder approach to data governance is better equipped to govern the complex data system in a transparent, inclusive, and distributed way, which reflects the interests of all stakeholders. So today's webinar, it will discuss successful examples of multi-stakeholder governance models and the implication of sustaining such models. So we are lucky to have very accomplished speakers today who will speak from their experience, and before which my colleague and co-author of the report will set up a context-setting presentation from what we discussed, how we discussed the multi-stakeholder governance in the World Development Report. I'd also like to thank our partner, a co-partner who has helped us organize this event, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And a lot of the discussion points from today will also feed into their Data Values Project, which is a global policy consultation that brings together diverse perspectives, research, and experience on major data challenges, leading to common agenda for collective advocacy. So before we begin, I just want to again say that we have two parts to today's event. The first part will be a presentation and by the speakers, and the second part will be a panel discussion. I will introduce all of the speakers in a little bit. But first, I would like here to introduce Adele Barcelet, who is one of the counsels for data and development in the Legal Operations Unit at the World Bank. She was the co-author for the World Development Report 2021 Data for Better Lives. And she's also co-led and contributed to global and regional assessments on data and digital governance. Her full bio will be shared in the chat. Adele, the floor is yours to set up the presentation on multi-stakeholder data governance.
Thank you very much, Malar. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you're connecting from in the world. As Malar mentioned, I'm going to take a few minutes to just set the scene for today's very interesting panel and explain a little bit more how why and how we have conceived of multi-stakeholder data governance as a key approach to create a foundation for trust for the evolving data economy. Next slide, please, Ken. Sorry, I can't actually see the presentation. Malar, can you confirm the presentation is up?
Yeah, I can see the presentation too. I think Ken is just sharing it.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Next slide, please, Ken. Thank you very much. So before we jump into what makes data governance multi-stakeholder, I wanted to take a moment to just remind everyone who has read the report or clarify for those who haven't yet how we define data governance in the WDR 2021. We consider infrastructure policies, laws and regulations, economic policies, and institutions to be the four pillars of a data governance framework that are needed to create this social contract for the way in which data is collected, processed, and used in an increasingly digital and data-driven economy and society. Next slide, please, Ken. So data governance goes beyond ensuring that data is properly managed. If you look at the figure on the right-hand side, when we talk about data management in the WDR, we're talking about the technical rules that are developed to determine how data is collected, processed, and used across its life cycle. Now, data governance is broader. It's about connecting good data management to developing a framework of norms, standards, rules, infrastructure, and institutions to ensure that the data that is effectively used is done so in a way that complies with the principles of this evolving social contract on data that Malar mentioned. Next slide, please. Now, the social contract on data is still evolving, but at least as we have defined it in the WDR, we consider it to be based on three pillars: trust, equity, and value. Now, for these outcomes to take place, these outcomes can't take place without ensuring that all the broad range of stakeholders or actors who have an interest in the data ecosystem and often have either asymmetric power or competing incentives participate in the development of the mechanisms that are established to govern data so that it can achieve its full potential and ensure it is not misused. It is really this inclusive or participatory approach to data governance that's the root of what we call multi-stakeholder governance. Ideally, this multi-stakeholder process should culminate in the development of shared principles and rules that foster trust, both in the process and the outcome, the way in which data is used, ensure or support an equitable distribution of the benefits of data, and ensure that data can be used to their full potential for development. Now, for these outcomes to occur, this requires, of course, the governance process itself to be open and transparent, fair and inclusive, in order to enable the meaningful participation of all stakeholders. That's really what multi-stakeholderism is all about. Next slide, please. So this example from Senegal's AgriData platform is a helpful illustration of the value that can be harnessed from data when an effective multi-stakeholder partnership is developed. So of course, beyond the technical aspects in this case of the need to create a data platform, et cetera, the key to the success of this sectoral initiative was from the start creating a trust environment that enabled the data silos both within government and between government and non-government stakeholders to be broken, generate buy-in and collaboration between government and the civil society organization that were the main participants in this partnership. It's also an interesting example in that it shows that oftentimes sector-specific initiatives can provide useful use cases to demonstrate quick wins while creating scalable foundations. It also shows another aspect of multi-stakeholderism, that multi-stakeholder initiatives don't always have to either start with or be led by government. That said, government buy-in will often be critical to the sustainability of these initiatives going forward. Next slide, please, Ken. Now, the key point to remember from this slide is that there is no one-size-fits-all model for multi-stakeholder data governance. Even if, and as you see from this figure here to the left, even if governments lead many of the data governance functions we've laid out here, non-government stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society, academia, and think tanks, even private individuals and international organizations, can all play important roles in shaping the process and outcome of each of these governance functions. For example, when you look at strategic planning, the private sector and civil society, through, for example, co-regulation or consultative rulemaking initiatives, can influence the design of strategies, policies, laws, and regulations that are ultimately adopted by government. When it comes to developing technical standards, for example, standards to support the interoperability of data systems, in some cases, and often actually, the private sector or technical non-government organizations, such as standard setting organizations or industry associations, may actually be better placed to play a more active role than government in developing these standards, given their expertise. And of course, when it comes to data governance functions that are more oriented towards learning and evidence, compliance, and accountability, academia and civil society, through their research and advocacy efforts, play a critical role in influencing data governance, these data governance functions, either by highlighting, new emerging risks or policy areas, bringing to light issues around data misuse and data abuses, and from a practical perspective, helping individuals and groups better understand their rights and also seek redress more effectively to enforce them. Of course, for these stakeholders to meaningfully participate, they need to be empowered to do so by the actors in the data ecosystem that have more influence and power. Next slide, please. So while we said that there is no one-size-fits-all model for multi-stakeholder data governance, the choice of the governance structure should be purpose-driven, and adapted to the local context. So in cases where the data policy issue at stake has a wide society impact or is a novel issue or is controversial, such as in the case in this example of, what do you do with data that is collected through sensors that are associated with internet or embedded in Internet of Things devices? In these cases, participatory, bottom-up, more democratic data governance approaches may be the best way to ensure that the broadest range of stakeholders are included in the decision-making process. Next slide, please. So, and one other example of sort of a controversial policy issue with a society-wide impact is, of course, the use of biometrics, particularly facial recognition technologies, by both the public and the private sector. In this example, I wanted to highlight the work that the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK did in establishing the Citizens Biometric Council in 2020, after calling for a moratorium on facial recognition. The purpose of this and the choice of the deliberative sort of assembly structure was very much purpose-driven. It was to facilitate public debate on the legal and ethical implications of biometric technology. In this case, the purpose wasn't to necessarily create consensus. It was very much to ensure that the full range of views from all stakeholders were captured by the deliberative process and included as inputs into the recommendations issued by the Council. One aspect about this particular initiative that I think is worth highlighting is the special effort that the Institute made to reach out to underrepresented, but often disproportionately impacted groups, such as members of the LGBTQ community and people with disabilities, through specific dedicated workshops to inform these policy recommendations. And this is a particularly important characteristic of robust multi-stakeholder data governance processes, to ensure that they are both inclusive and truly representative in both process and outcome. Next slide, please. So now you've seen that there clearly seems to be a high potential for the value of multi-stakeholder data governance approaches to better govern data. Of course, potential aside, there are still barriers to the effective implementation of these processes that can affect their legitimacy. In identifying these challenges, it's quite helpful to look to the example of the internet governance experience, which chose to govern the internet on using a multi-stakeholder model. If we want to group challenges or barriers into two different categories, I think it's helpful to think about barriers to actually access or participate in existing multi-stakeholder processes. Barriers to access or participation, may be due to cost issues, capacity constraints, or just pure physical access in the times before we moved to living and working fully online. These challenges particularly affect low and middle income countries and marginalized groups. When there are multi-stakeholder governance processes that see some degree of participation from a broader range of stakeholders, that participation may not necessarily be meaningful if the process is merely consultative, or where there are no effective feedback loops between the different types of stakeholders, or when the input of non-government stakeholders is not taken into consideration in the final decision-making process. This can actually be even worse in some cases than not having a multi-stakeholder process in the beginning, and can backfire, affecting trust and legitimacy. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, if I wanted, if you took any key messages away from this presentation, I hope they are these. The first message is that multi-stakeholder governance is an approach to achieving a robust social contract for data that's based on trust, value, and equity. It's not an end in of itself. These outcomes are only achieved if the multi-stakeholder process is open, transparent, inclusive, and participatory. And its legitimacy really does require meaningful participation from all stakeholders. Now, that process and that participation can take different forms. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and the process should be purpose-driven and adapted to the context and the specific, both the institutional context and the broader questions around the type of data and the type of data use. In specific cases, bottom-up approaches to data governance can actually help realign power asymmetries in the use of data, such as the use of biometrics or facial recognition technologies that we saw earlier. When multi-stakeholder governance processes are adopted, some barriers to their effective implementation include underrepresentation of marginalized or underrepresented groups and countries, including low and middle income countries, due to inclusion, cost, and capacity constraints. In order to mitigate these challenges, this will require earmarking specific funding, building capacity, and providing multiple platforms for communication and engagement, as well as ensuring that international cooperation is strengthened so that low and middle income countries in particular don't just remain standard takers, but can meaningfully participate in these global forums. Thank you very much for your time. I really look forward to the panel. I'm happy to answer any questions after the fact.
Thank you, Adele, for setting the scene and sort of unpacking the different types of approaches. Now we'll move next to the short presentation by our expert panelists. I'd like to first welcome Dr. Natalie Banner. She's the lead for Understanding Patient Data, an initiative hosted at the Wellcome Trust in the UK, aiming to make the uses of patient data more visible, understandable, and trustworthy. Her full bio will be pasted in the chat window. In 2020, she was named in Intelligent Health AI's top 50 AI innovators. Welcome, Dr. Natalie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mala, and thanks, Adele, for a great presentation to kick us off there. Really appreciate the kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here. So as Mala said, I work in the health data context, specifically looking at the ways that health data that is routinely collected as part of a person's care can be used for other purposes, such as planning healthcare services or for research. Now, this is sensitive data, even if it has had identifying information removed. But of course, at the same time, access to and use of this data is really vital for running and improving health and care services. In England, at least, this data can be used for those purposes without the explicit consent of the patient. It's subject to all sorts of safeguards, but of course it is controversial, especially if the data is being used by third parties, including academics, charities, and particularly commercial entities such as pharmaceutical and increasingly technology companies. Now, recently there has been a widespread public, political and media backlash about plans to pull together data that is held in general practice, that is these primary care physicians, and it was labelled in the media as a data grab. But this is just the latest in a series of controversies, but it does highlight just how hot button an issue this can be for members of the public. Before the pandemic, if you can remember those times, we actually conducted some deliberative research using citizens' juries to explore people's views about third parties accessing and using health data that is held by the NHS in England. And that context is important because it provided the groundwork and the inspiration for the governance model I want to talk about today. It really drove directly from the conversations we had with citizens as part of these discussions, the approach that we developed. Now, in contrast to the very forward-thinking WDR report lifecycle approach to data, health data collection, management, and access is usually a bit of a pipeline. So the data is collected, a data custodian holds it, there is a process for accessing and asking for access to that data. Data is then used in various ways for research, for planning, and so on. But there are these sort of gateways along the way. And often those include something like an access committee. Now, this is a group of people that decides whether a proposed use of data is appropriate, is it legitimate, is it lawful, is it in the public interest, for example. But the governance focus here is very much on that access point, the point at which someone requests access to that data. Lots of discussion and decisions about what criteria should be used, what should count as public benefit, what's in the public interest, and so on. But it is still a pipeline. Once you've passed that access point, if the data is then used, we tend not to really find out what's happened to it. And sometimes it will result in academic publications, possibly the development of new algorithms, and so on. When we talk to jurors about this process and explain this pipeline to them, they challenged us back. They essentially said, well, why is this process a pipeline? Why is it not a feedback loop? They asked, how on earth do you tell if the proclaimed benefits of the data use, which you have to anticipate when you're seeking access, how do you know if they actually happen? How do you learn from what works and what doesn't when you're making future decisions about who can get access to data and why and under what circumstances? So how are the decision makers who are making a call on whether to allow access to this data, how are they held to account? And frankly, why aren't we more collectively involved, we as the citizens? And their reasoning here was simple. The data is about us. We have a stake in how it's used. We are stakeholders in this. And although you might often get a patient or public participant, a lay representative, for example, on these decision-making committees, there doesn't often appear to be much more substantive involvement than that. So this really led us to question and to develop a new model that we called learning data governance. Now, the idea of learning data governance is it's based on the idea of a learning health system. And a learning health system is one that constantly collects data, but it iterates, it learns, it feeds back, it adapts its processes. And the idea behind learning data governance was to add 2 additional components to existing health data practices and decisions about access to data. Firstly, the outcomes, whether they're positive, negative, null, from the uses of data are reported back to the decision makers who allowed access to that data. Secondly, some form of public participant, citizen, panel or forum scrutinizes those previous decisions. And then they feed back on the criteria, on the process. They say, you missed this question. It would have been helpful to ask this. Why did you not anticipate that particular outcome? The idea being that they are asking questions to inform that future decision making. And this introduces a loop of accountability into data governance back to this citizen panel, group or forum. And the idea is that it can take any different kind of form, but key, it's not part of the decision making process itself, but is external to it. It is holding it to account. So essentially they're asking, did we ask the right questions when this particular data access request was made? What did we miss? They're scrutinizing the process and seeking to improve it for next time. Now, this approach has several advantages over existing models of data governance, not least sort of having learning and dynamism in data governance, particularly because tech capabilities are evolving so rapidly. We are going to need to update our priors essentially on what might work, what might not. Public views and sensitivities are going to change over time. But the idea is it shifts the perception of governance from being a blocker to an enabler of trustworthy practice and ultimately more effective uses of data. The challenge, of course, is in implementation. We've discussed this idea with various parts of the health service. The charity Cancer Research UK is developing a model for its commercial partnerships based on this learning data governance idea. But it involves risk-taking and opening up decision-making in a way that many data custodians, especially in the health service, are not comfortable with. So I'm afraid I can't sit here and tell you that we have all the evidence that this works brilliantly and makes a big difference, but I just wanted to sort of plant that seed and to see if this idea of a reflexive element to the governance process and one that doesn't create a bottleneck in decision-making resonates with any other speakers and participants here today. And really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalie. That was really inspiring. The notion of learning data governance, almost applying, sort of machine learning to the process element, and creating that dynamism. I mean, we discussed more of this, I think, during the panel discussion, but I want to move on to the next speaker now. Sorry, I'm just checking who's on my list. I want to welcome Mariana Verise, who's the director of Amazon Landscapes Wildlife Conservation Society. And she is the director and also coordinates the citizen science for the Amazon network. She's a natural resources economist, I'm going to paste the full bio in the chat window. But based on your example, we do have a spotlight in the report, Mariana, which is a really great example, and maybe you're presenting some of that here today. But the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Malar, and everybody. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yes, I will tell you today about the citizen science for the Amazon network, and one of the tools or we have developed over the past few years. It's called Ictio. Ictio is a shared database and app developed to address a major challenge in the Amazon, the need of large amounts of data on fish and fisheries across the Amazon basin. And why this challenge? The Amazon basin, as many of you probably know, is approximately the size of the continental United States, and it is the largest and most biodiverse freshwater system in the world. Giant migratory catfish in the Amazon swim from the Andes foothills to the estuary in the Atlantic Ocean and back. It's about 11,000 kilometers in total. It's the longest continental migration in the world. And in this way, Amazon migratory fish species are effective sentinels of the ecosystem health, and they are also critical as an economic resource in the region. They represent about 80% of all fish, commercial fish landings across the basin. So 4 out of fish sold in the Amazon are migratory fish. Next, please. So sustainable management of fisheries in the Amazon require a basin-wide ecosystem management approach, and that requires lots of data at scale of the basin. And with this data, hopefully we'll reach coordinated policies and decisions across multiple stakeholders, countries, and scales. So the Amazon is extremely diverse and complex context, with many countries and subnational political units and different ways of doing fisheries. So we needed to create a solution to generate, share, and use data to inform fisheries management at appropriate scales. This is at the scale of the migrations. And Ictio is an Android app and a shared database to collect, manage, and share data on fish observations in the Amazon. And here there's a little trick. It collects fish observations, but it collects observations of fished fish. So it collects observations of the activity of fishing. And thus it might affect the privacy and the rights of fishers who contribute to this information. So to develop Ictio, it was very important that we build from the knowledge, capacities, and experiences of local partners, mostly civil society organizations, fisher folks, educators, scientists, and other experts. And we used an adaptive management approach, like Jenna was mentioning, with an iterative process that accumulates learnings and improves practices along the way. Today, I would like to share 2 core aspects of Ictio that I think are good for the discussion. The first one is our approach to reach scale. And the second one is our commitment to situated openness, to manage the tension between the ambition of contributing to open science and open knowledge, and the need of protecting the rights of the participants in this effort. And next slide, please. So a core element of Ictio is that it is supported by a network of local partners, also research organizations and other types of organizations, but that connect existing local fisheries management initiatives across the Amazon. And in this way, we aim to reach scale. the Amazon has a very rich experience in community-based fisheries monitoring and management. They have a lot of share and they are very diverse and many are very successful, but they are mostly local in scale. So they do not reach the scale of the fish migrations. They are good, but they are not enough. They are necessary, but not enough. And that is why we opted to connect them and in this way to reach scale. So this map provides an overview of the data collection sites registered in ICTIO so far, and you can see how the dots follow the routes of the rivers. Next slide, please. Data is provided by communities, fisher folk, and different organizations, and they use multiple tools, but shared protocols and database. And as of July of this year, we had over 55,000 observations registered across the basin. And the shared database follows GBIF standards so that they are good for science global standards. Next slide, please. And the second aspect I would like to highlight is our approach to have a scaled way of accessing data. So data is open to the public, but is blurred at a sub-basin level, like these little polygons in orange and red you see there, top left of the slide. And then in the other extreme, individual users have full access to their own data. Only network partners or researchers with specific permits and agreements have access to anonymous data with coordinates. And in this way, we are testing whether if it's possible to manage the tension that I mentioned before, open science versus protecting the rights of participants. Next slide, please. And it's just a short note on the citizen science for the Amazon network. And we have been focusing a lot on the data and the tool, but it's really the people and the institutions behind it that has made it possible and that is behind this governance. The protocols, terms of use, data collection agreements, all these instruments and detailed negotiations that need to take place were possible because of the network of partners, over 30 partners in 7 countries. Of multiple disciplines, if you want, or sectors. And it is a sort of regional network of local networks. And the role of local partners in engaging citizen scientists or fisher folks in this process is critical, and also their way of informing negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. Such a great example of an initiative which touches on so many elements of data governance and multi-stakeholder engagement at such a local level, that's having an impact. And great points that you brought up about, stakeholder engagement and also how you do this at scale. And I think really eager to talk more about this in the discussion. Thank you again. Next, I would like to welcome Stefan Verhoost. The floor is yours, but let me give a small introduction before you start, Stefan. He's the co-founder and chief research and development officer of the governance laboratory, the GovLab at the New York University. It's an action research center focused on improving governance using advances in science and technology, including data and collective intelligence. In 2018, he was recognized as one of the 10 most influential academics in digital government globally by the global policy platform Apolitical. Welcome, Stefan. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks so much, and it's great to be here and delighted to join this distinguished panel. As you already indicated, I'm indeed the co-founder of GovLab, and our mission is to really look into how do we transform the way we make decisions in the public interest. And within that context, we have focused on how do we reuse data in a way that can improve decisions, but also, of course, can be done in a way that is responsible to those that include the data subjects, but also those that will ultimately be impacted by the insights generated from the data as such. And so it's within that context that we were delighted to see that the World Development Report focused indeed on the reuse of data as a mechanism to generate value, because from our point of view, especially from a governance point of view, the reuse of data, as Natalie also had indicated, actually is not yet well understood, and we don't really have yet the governance structures in place to do so in a manner that is systematic and responsible. Mainly because data governance originates, of course, many years ago, and one of the key instruments is the Fair Information Practice Principles that starts from the purpose specification, i.e. you can only use the data for which it was specified. And what we are talking about is actually reusing it for other purposes. That's where I think it requires a new governance approach and a proactive way to think about how do we do this in a responsible way without creating an environment where we cannot actually generate value that would improve people's lives. So within that context, we have developed a whole range of initiatives where we engage multiple stakeholders to what we call establish a social license for reusing data. A social license that really takes into account the expectations and the values of a variety of stakeholders, but also a social license that indicates what can and what cannot be done within the context of reusing data in order to steer the reuse in a more responsible way. And so I will just illustrate two examples that can give you a flavor on how one can go about this. Those are not perfect. They are because, as was mentioned, we're all iterating and trying to find ways to do this in a better way. But at least we have some examples that shows a growing practice of actually engaging multiple stakeholders in determining the governance framework for reuse. The first example, and I will put some also some links in the chat for those that want to explore it more. But the first example is the data assembly, which is an example or an initiative that we developed here in New York City at the time of COVID, early time of COVID-19. Obviously, we are still countering the pandemic worldwide as well. But one of the key, of course, discussions, and if we could perhaps pull up the website on the screen here as well, one of the key areas within the context of COVID-19 was, of course, how can we start reusing data, such as, for instance, cell phone data or mobile data or other data, including other health data, in a way that can inform the response and subsequent recovery of COVID-19. And so what we established was basically a citizens' assembly in New York City to inform the city on how this can be done in a way that is aligned with citizens and residents of New York City's expectations and their value systems. And so how we did this was by creating a whole range of mini publics, basically mini publics that involved, on the one hand, public officials and also those that need to have access to the data. On the other hand, data holders and those that could make sense of the data, but also residents themselves, that they could actually engage and co-creating the data governance framework in which that could take place. What we did then was to engage with trusted institutions. In this case, this was the public libraries of New York City. And I do believe that public libraries have actually a very important role to play in actually being the broker of that kind of conversations around data in a trusted way. And so we engaged the public libraries in New York City, and we co-hosted a set of those public mini publics. And each mini public started with a set of scenarios to actually make the reuse real, right? Because it's quite often the discussions are fairly abstract in terms of what about anonymized data or aggregated data? But if we don't really show what are possible use cases and what are the elements that needs to be in place in order to make this feasible, it remains too abstract to actually be meaningful. So we introduced a set of scenarios, and then we introduced also a set of concepts, because each of those assemblies were also opportunities for actually education, so that we actually had a equal level playing kind of discussions, as opposed to a discussion where some actually know what, for instance, aggregation means, and others, frankly, have no idea what we are talking about. And so we introduced scenarios, and then subsequently, we went the extra mile to actually introduce those concepts in order for then to have a discussion, a deliberation around what scenario, anyway, would resonate or would be inappropriate, what are expectations, and more importantly, what we did then was to co-create the framework to actually design a possible reuse of data for COVID-19. And here we focused on the why. So what would be the purposes that would be appropriate? The what kind of data would actually be relevant or would be offensive? Who should have access to the data, and who would you trust? How would you access the data? In what kind of mechanisms would you want to have in place to oversee, for instance, the use of the data? When should this be forever? Should this be limited to only COVID-19 or only to a particular kind of timing? And what would be the focus, and so on? And we did this just to indicate that we really need to go beyond the binary discussions around the reuse, because too often, anyway, we see all those surveys, are you for or against the reuse of data? Well, it matters. Well, it depends. And what we tried to do was to basically determine what is it that determines it depends. And so those kinds of questions were actually the questions that we sought to probe. And this led to basically a governance structure that was co-created by these mini publics that subsequently informed New York City on how to access and reuse data for COVID-19. A second example that I will use, just to give you a flavor that we can actually have multi-stakeholder engagement across the data lifecycle, is the 100 Questions Initiative. And the 100 Questions Initiative really tries to start from the question and not the data. Too often, discussions about data, and especially about reuse of data, are focused and quite often only focused on the data. What data would you be appropriate for reuse? And what we have tried to establish here is to actually establish a multi-stakeholder initiative that starts by, well, let's first also determine the purpose, and then we can have a discussion about what data would be appropriate. And so the 100 questions tries to identify the 100 questions that matter, for which the reuse of data could be transformative, and for which we also could start developing data collaboratives if there is a clear indication that the purpose is aligned with, ultimately, on the one hand, those that are in the field working on the subject feel are unanswered questions, and then the public at large. And so how we do this is a multi-step process. I'm not going to go into full detail, but here it's a combination of what we call, on the one hand, bilingual, people that have a domain expertise and a data expertise, because you do need to engage them as well to really try to understand what are the kinds of purposes that could be transformative, and then the public at large that then can engage on prioritization or submitting their own questions as well. Anyway, these are two examples that gives you a flavor of what can be done around the reuse of data, both in terms of co-designing the governance structure or having a more public deliberation around different scenarios, so that you actually have a sense on what is it that people care about, what are their values that they bring to the table. And then the other one was really about thinking not just about, anyway, having a conversation once the data is already being reused or once the data is collected, for instance, but also let's start, anyway, higher up on the food chain and start having a conversation about what are the kinds of questions that you actually care about, that we should have a reuse strategy for. And that changes then also the conversation later on with regard to how to go about this and whether it is appropriate if we actually have a consensus on the purpose. With that, over to you. I might have taken too much time already, but happy to go into detail depending on the questions that are being posed.
Thanks, Stefan. I mean, a lot of interesting examples and, especially, again, the two links that you shared. But thanks for, again, pointing out the importance of use and reuse, which we also try to do in the report. And I think we'll get back to some, I have several questions for all of you, but we'll come back to that, I guess, in the panel discussion. Now I'd like to welcome Victor. And let me provide a quick introduction. And Victor, then the floor is yours. Victor Ahurogu is a Senior Africa Regional Manager for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. He leads on several country-level political and technical engagements that aim to catalyze progress and strengthen data ecosystems. Welcome, Victor. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here discussing this very important topic. Very quickly, for context, we work with several stakeholder groups at both national and global levels to explore opportunities for supporting countries in developing and implementing roadmaps for harnessing the data revolution for development and the SDGs. And, in the last 5 years, we have been able to broker over 100 partnerships, successful partnerships across the world, delivering on the agenda of data for the SDGs. And of course, in achieving this, we strongly have leveraged multi-stakeholder governance. And I'll be speaking to one of the model, likely the collaborative governance model, in doing this. And of course, I'm sure our participants know what that really means. And that was well defined by Ansel and Gash, in 2008. And he said, and they put it as a governing arrangement where one or more public agencies directly engage non-state stakeholders in a collective decision-making process that is formal, consensus-oriented, and deliberative, and that aims to make or implement public policy or manage public programs and assets, end of quote. And I can give a quick summary of our approach just to put in proper context. And so what we see across countries, particularly for my role in Africa, is having countries and public agencies across these countries express their demands to us on a particular challenge or an issue that limits effective policy, decision making. And it could be the issue of access to data, lack of capacity in the use of data within a specific use case that pretty much links to a policy issue within the country. And following that, we undertake an intense consultation process across the various stakeholder groups just for us to fully understand this challenge. And of course, also understand the power play and the imbalance that exists within that specific space and sector. And, collaboratively agree on the approach to how the collaborative should be set up to advance the agenda. And then we go on to hold, series of convenings. And this takes, 3 to 4, 5, 6 months over the place. And the essence is that we want to use that to foster participation, inclusion, and ownership at the country level. And we do this through negotiations of those priorities and the needs that are coming from the different, players. And the important thing to note here is that there's a huge amount of time spent on balancing among individual, institutional, and national interests just to help us achieve a common agenda. And in the course of doing this, we're able to establish an agreed governance framework to guide the process and realize the outcomes as being agreed upon, including the issue of data governance. We also use that opportunity to mobilize resources, both within the country and from outside of the country, and extensively broker several partnerships within this, process. And at various nodes, decision-making processes, are undertaken through consensus throughout the life of the program or the initiative. And that's pretty much, what happens at the country level. And I can give you 1 or 2 practical examples. For instance, in Sierra Leone, in 2018, we were asked to support the country in revamping the Open Data Council, which is the highest level mechanism for advancing data access and open data issue in the country. And there are about 70 different organizations that are members of the Open Data Council. It was a very lengthy and complex process of engagement and consultations, and that led to a recommendation that we made to the ODC in terms of the governance structure that should be put in place. And this included both political and technical level layers of governance. And that was pretty successful. And we were then asked to help put together three various collaboratives for the country. And to date, we have 3 successful collaboratives that have been implemented in Sierra Leone on education, on agriculture, and on the environment. An instance also is Ghana. We've got several, our collaboratives going on in Ghana, but of interest is the one we did help Institute on Agriculture. The interesting thing to note here was that we were able to find a private sector, entity who partnered with government. That's the Ghana Statistical Service, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the National Agency for Disaster Management, and of course brought some, CSOs and farmers, 1,600 farmers across 3 regions of the country, all speaking together on this particular issue with a couple of development partners, aiming to strengthen resilience of farmers to climate change by providing them climate smart advisories, market prices, etc., through mobile technology. And another third example we have here is Senegal. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of a time, but quite interesting to note was the work we did in Senegal, which was about supporting the creation and the strengthening of the country's governance framework on data for agriculture. One of the examples that you pretty mentioned in the outset of this panel session, and the one we did also on environment. So we helped put in a couple of structures in place that pulled in political level leaders across various ministries of government, brought in technical level leadership from several agencies and civil society groups and development partners, and then of course also had a secretariat that was housed at IPA, which you did mention. A few lessons learned from all of this is the fact that one, this process requires great patience and substantial time investment, which is often needed to build trust in a multi-stakeholder setting. We've seen that it often takes 4 to 6 months of engagement to often establish this at the country level. The second lessons to learn to note here is the need to acknowledge and build on existing systems rather than to run a purely new and parallel system in any one country. And the third one is this process becomes more effective when there is a neutral, broker or convener. We've seen that in most instances, there is a huge, silo approach to the work that government institutions do undertake at the country level. Many of them, in a lot of the meetings and the brokerings that we have enabled at the country level, have never come together to speak to each other on a particular agenda on data. And so we coming in to broker, those conversations, made it very possible for them to come together because we're providing a neutral ground and space for them to, come together on the issue of data. And the fourth issue here is that it's important to put forward a value proposition that is mutual to everyone within that process. This relates to the sort of incentives that are motivating and able to meet to a large extent the need of all the parties in the collaborative. The fifth one is around anchoring the process itself within a legitimate organization and finding a focal point or a champion that's got the mandate, the responsibility, and the incentive to drive the agenda. And finally, it's also important to be able to negotiate and navigate carefully between what is political and what is technical. This causes a lot of confusion within multi-stakeholder setups. So thank you. I'm so sorry for taking so much time. I hope that a lot of the partners listening and folks would have a lot of questions after this presentation. Thank you. Over to you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Victor. I mean, 5 points that you raised, I think all great points on incentives and, how do you navigate, between the political and the technical processes. Thank you all. I just want to move into now, get a little bit, unpack all the great, interesting ideas that you've brought together. So I first want to start with maybe a question that actually came up in the chat window, a question about how do we ensure that multi-stakeholder data governance will work when rural and peri-urban folks do not trust the authorities to use the data for its intended purpose. So just going back to the idea of trust, and that, Dr. Natalie, you talked about accountability mechanisms, which I feel is really important to create that trust and keep people engaged. Because one is, you see often a lot of these multi-stakeholder engagements starting, but then, it's hard to sustain them. It's a lot of effort, as Victor pointed out. There's a lot of, you have to create incentives. Maybe I start with you on, if you can talk a little bit more about how these mechanisms have worked. Have you been able to make decisions? Has it changed any of the decision-making process, which is built more trust in the, in this multi-stakeholder data governance itself?
Yeah, thanks, Malon, and a great question. I mean, I can't speak personally to the sort of the rural and peri-urban and split, and I'd be really interested in other panelists' views on that. But certainly a big challenge here is you can kind of set up these processes, you can seek people's views, and then promptly, a report is written and everyone earnestly agrees and nods and says, oh yes, that's all terribly important. But what changes and what comes back to benefit the individuals who have put time and effort and energy into participating, into learning, into engaging with these areas that they might not previously have been familiar with? And in fact, I think as was mentioned earlier, you can actually do more damage by setting up a process and giving the impression that everything's up for grabs and that individuals are going to have a really big influence in a process or decision making. And then what happens down the line? And actually that doesn't happen. So an awful lot of thought, I think, as you mentioned, Marlon, needs to go into sustainability, into thinking about, well, what is actually coming back to the individuals that are feeding into this process? And frankly, the reasons for lack of trust might be very legitimate. And I think we really need to be quite humble about that, not start from the point that, of course, the use of data is innovative and great, and we just need to persuade people of that and figure out how to get the messaging right. There are really good reasons why people might feel exploited, marginalized, disenfranchised in the first place. So we're not starting from a neutral position. And I think even just recognizing that, and that not everyone is going to think that these uses of data are brilliant. One person's fantastic innovation is another's creepy invasion of privacy. And just starting from that point of going, actually, you know what, we might not know how to use this data in the way that is going to bring benefits back to individuals, back to, in my case, a health system, back to patients. But, I think across all of the examples here, really, great discussions across the panel, thinking through what benefits are actually coming back to the individuals who are participating. And I say benefits, not just from the perspective of those who are using the data, from the individual's perspective, what matters to them in their lives, what's going to enable them to live their life better, to access services more, to improve their lives. And I think if we adopt that perspective, that stands a chance of building systems that are more trustworthy inherently, rather than assuming that the data holders or the data users have all the answers from the outset.
Great points. I think I'm going to steal a lot of those nuggets that you just shared, but I cannot, I'm sure everybody agrees that I think putting people at the center of building data systems and thinking about reuse is really important. And that's something we've tried to also bring out in the report. Just picking up where you sort of kind of left off about, keeping this question about what benefits are coming back to the individuals, always being humble about that point. I want to just turn to Mariana and, the scale at which you're doing this. I mean, I just wanted to just point this little sort of nugget around, the initiative that you are organizing, which is, for people living in the basin of the Amazon River. I just want to, just for people who don't know, it's the area the size of the continental United States and the home for 30 million people. And fish is the most important source of animal protein, and fishing is the most important source of income. I just want to kind of present the scale at which they're trying to solve the problem there. And Mariana, can you talk a little bit about, this, again, back to the sustainability of these multi-stakeholder engagements? You talked about a huge network, and how do you keep people engaged, especially when you engage with communities that are, often don't have an understanding about, the value of data. And, it's a bigger cost, especially to them, to be engaged in these processes and sort of trying to understand, like Stefan was saying, you throw out like different things and they may not understand. So can you talk a little bit about it, especially your engagement with the indigenous groups and how you're kind of bringing all of these processes? Any great examples of how you made good things happen because of this multi-stakeholder engagement?
I think there are two things that gave us advantage when we started this ambitious, crazy idea. One is that the data is generated by the people. It's not data about people. We call them citizen scientists or community scientists or community-based monitors. There are several names for this role in the people. And by generating data about fish observations, it may look innocuous, it's also data about their fishing activities. And it also involves sharing their knowledge about fishing somewhat, because they know where to fish, when is best to fish, how to fish, what species. All these aspects influence the data that they collect and share. And the second difference is that what I mentioned before, that we build from existing strong, long-term community-based fisheries monitoring and management projects, initiatives. And this is something that has been happening for between 2 decades and 5 years, depending on the area in the Amazon. And it's these local fisheries management initiatives are associated with fishing permits, with fishing allocation of fishing quotas. So it's very close to their economic activities, to core economic activities of these communities or these fisher folk associations. I think these are two aspects that are very important that already gave a strong foundation for trying to scale up. And the key to the success and long-term sustainability of the network, we don't know yet. We are trying. Whoever tells you they have the full picture, it's fishy. The local partners who have long-term partnerships with these communities and these fisher folks associations have a critical role. And there is a very good connection among local partners across the basin, sharing learning, sharing experience. But the next step that is very important for us is to foster the connection, the direct connection among fisher folks. And before the COVID-19, we managed to do in-person sub-regional workshops. And they were very powerful, and people started their WhatsApp groups on their own and started sharing and connecting. The pandemic has really imposed a big toll on this. We stopped everything that is not online. But I think a very important, crucial element for long-term sustainability for the people who participate is that the data is useful, that they can use the data for tracking their sales, for informing, completing their management plans, their local management plans and fishing permits. And then a next step is for fisheries authorities and scientists to acknowledge that citizen science data is good quality data. And that's why we have put a lot of emphasis in the design and data quality processes too. One last thought is that the question how can we promote people to engage if they don't trust that authorities will use the data the way it is intended to? I think, unfortunately, we need to use the starting point. We need to start by assuming that the data will not be used the way it was intended. So it obviously will, but it may be used in other ways. So that once the data is out, you lose control of the data. And in this sense, we have been considering, we work with indigenous and local communities in the Amazon many times in very remote areas. We have assumed a very conservative approach to sharing the data and to, on the access of the data. And we have given the citizen scientist groups and their local partners the lead on that. And yeah, I think that's for now. The only other thing I would like to just give the title is the data has to be useful. That means that we are putting a lot of effort in interpreting the data and giving the people access to the data and interpreting it in ways they request it, so it's useful for them.
Thanks, Mariana, again, for reiterating the point about making the data useful for the people the data is about, in order for it to fundamentally improve trust in the data systems. So Stefan, you talked about some of the interesting examples that the data assemblies in New York in the COVID times. I'm sure they're sort of keen to understand, so through the efforts that you did, what changes did you see? What came out of that? What learnings can you share from that? And also, if you want to touch upon a little bit about the power imbalances, especially, people who are more informed about this being engaged is one thing, but, we're really talking about people who are typically left out of the conversation or lack an understanding of this. And how do we get them to be more engaged as part of and anything you can talk to about that from your experience in New York would be great.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, these are very important questions, but to a large extent, I would say these are questions that you can somewhat anticipate while you're designing a multi-stakeholder intervention. And I think these are actually design kind of features that you have to embed. For instance, if you start thinking about what is the kind of impact we want to have and who do we want to influence, with regard to the outcome of the deliberation, then it's very important to have them on board before you start, that there is actually an audience there, as opposed to have a deliberation and then hopefully afterwards have an audience that is willing to actually listen and take them on board. And I think part of the design is to think about the deliberation from an end-to-end kind of approach, which includes an understanding on who is the target audience and how do you engage them early on in a way that they feel what is happening has value to their processes as well. Same thing with regard to the power imbalances. I think quite often when we talk about inclusion and inclusive processes, which obviously is a design principle that one should take into account, but quite often that means that sometimes we take an assumption like, let's try to involve everyone, right? But I think it does require also to really start thinking about what groups do we need to involve, and who do we need, and how we need to curate those that are actually part of the deliberation. And I think curation is equally important as inclusion. Because based upon the curation, you might actually identify that certain groups are not there, but you could curate the composition in a way that actually does take into account some of those power imbalances. And so these are, design elements as it relates to the way we go about multi-stakeholder governance. I'm going to put in the chat a paper I wrote a few years ago, because in the past I did a lot of work around internet governance as well, from the multi-stakeholder point of view. And I think it includes a set of lessons on how you can actually structure multi-stakeholder approach as well. And one of the lessons is, and one of the design principles is that it matters how you frame the deliberation. What is this about? Because different framing will incentivize different actors to engage. For instance, the framing as this is citizen science from a scientific point of view, then you will have a different incentive for engagement than if you would frame it as was framed. This is about your well-being. This is about your livelihood. And then suddenly creates a whole different incentive to participate. The framing is very important on how you go about this deliberation. Also very important is to start thinking about what element in the policy cycle or in the decision cycle do you want to influence, or do you want to be part of? Do you want to be part of the agenda setting? Do you want to be part of the actually ideation of solutions? Do you want to be part of the review of enforcement? Different policy stages may require different multi-stakeholder engagements, and that's something to take into account. There are other elements there as well, but I want to have one more, is that you ultimately also have to not only focus on legitimacy, which is of course is very important, but also effectiveness, which is coming back to your early question, but also effectiveness in sense of timing. It was interesting to hear Victor here how long it takes, and it does take long, but we also have to make sure that you could be very legitimate, but totally ineffective because it takes years, right? And so you have to design in a way on how can you be agile while at the same time inclusive, right, and legitimate. And I think those are the elements that you have to start thinking through when you develop those multi-stakeholder approaches.
Thank you, Stefan. That's a great point about, while keeping our focus on legitimacy, we also need to ensure that it's effective and it's useful. At the end of the day, being able to demonstrate that both during the framing stages, but continuously, I think, reflecting that. And I think same point that Dr. Natalie brought up about the feedback loops and continuously sort of refining how we are engaging with the different stakeholders. Victor, now I'd like to move on to you. There's a question from the chat. You're welcome to either answer to that or, but I, would also pose sort of a similar question to you that I asked Stefan, but considering your experience working in lower middle income countries, how do you view, again, this notion of power imbalance, especially working in, lower middle income countries? And the question from the chat was, what are the key performance indicators for a sustainable data governance framework, particularly for lower middle income countries? So you could kind of, if you want to bring in the power imbalance into the question around the performance indicators, you're welcome to, or however you choose to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will, my time this time around, I know I did overshoot my time during the presentation. Just a few things to know in terms of those, success factors or indicators that we do strongly watch out for as we help to build a multi-stakeholder, process at the country level is one that ensures that consensus is achieved on a specific agenda by all members of that, multi-stakeholder group. It's important that you take into cognizance all the various voices that needs to be, taken on board, ensuring that they're in by, everyone. It can be a very difficult process, and that's why it said it takes a lot, time to make that happen. And there are normally a lot of back end, I would say, conversations, one-on-one, individual conversations with each of these stakeholders ever before you bring them all together in one meeting. And so you want to be sure that you've heard their voices, you've been able to address their concerns, and you can bring all of the issues together and be able to have that, conversations at the national level, at the subnational level, that then ties everyone together into one common agenda. And second is also ensuring that this common agenda is pretty aligned with the agreed national priority. Because sometimes if you're not careful, what you might come out of out of those meetings might be an institutional agenda and not necessarily fully aligned with that key national priority of government at that point in time. And then the third thing is also ensuring a bottom-up approach. The voices have to come from beneath. They have to pretty much be able to say to you, and I love the way that Stefan did put it, that it's got to be about the people. Let's start from the key questions, not necessarily around data, but what is the key issue here? How is it affecting you as a farmer? And putting those issues, and putting these voices and these different groups and stakeholders right in the front and center of the conversation, is quite enabling. And I think one of the key things that we have also been very careful about is about transferring capacity through all the various stages of the process to the players, the individuals, the local institutions. That makes for sustainability in the long term. When all of our global partners have exited, we want to be sure that these, our different institutions at the local level have the capacity to continue to push, the agenda. And I think the last thing is around legitimacy. It's pretty important. So these are some of the things that, I've seen across the work we've done in the last 4 years that helps us, to achieve success in the module that we have advanced. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I didn't even realize that we've kind of almost coming to the end of 90 minutes. It's been a great session. I want to just give all of you the floor, maybe as a way to, if you want to leave the audience or with sort of a final thought, or you could also react to any comments from other panelists here. For those of us who are working in multi-stakeholder data governance, you want to kind of give some final thoughts, as a way for us to think about what are some of the things we need to work on or pay attention to. So I leave the floor to the panelists for that. We could go in the same order. Maybe Dr. Natalie, do you want to start again?
Okay, thanks, Mala. I'll have a stab at that. Sorry, my brain is just buzzing with thoughts from this discussion. So I'll try and summarize the key thing that I'm leaving this with, I think, which is around, it's to do with sort of bringing those multiple stakeholders together and actually the reflection that the big challenge I see here is being able to handle diversity of views and perspectives without being paralyzed. Because fundamentally, and as Stefan said, you still need to be effective at the end of the day. Decisions still need to be made and acted on. And I was mulling over this sort of notion of consensus and whether it's always possible to achieve consensus, because actually, if you're striving for consensus, that may well blind you to the fact that there are legitimately different views and perspectives that need to be heard and raised and amplified. So I suppose what I'm leaving this with is trying to think about whether there are ways of ensuring that as part of a multi-stakeholder approach to governance, you can have outcomes that not everyone might agree with, but they can nonetheless see the process that you've gone through and the perspectives you've drawn on, and they can kind of respect that process. So I might not agree with an outcome or a decision or something like that, but I can still say, actually, there's been a really good process here of reaching those conclusions and getting to that point. And there may well be some contours and guardrails that can be broadly agreed upon, particularly, I think, in relation to the distribution of power when it comes to data. So I think really, if we have a focus on mitigating risks of exploitation or some uses of data causing harm or exacerbating inequalities and inequities, then even if we can't sort of reach full consensus about appropriate processes and so on, there is at least a way forward where you can take on board and respect a diversity of perspectives, but still drive towards effectiveness and actually progress. So we don't just sort of end up getting stuck in a cycle of sort of not quite knowing what to do because so many people have different views. So sorry, not particularly coherent summary, but that's just where this conversation has left me.
No, I think it's a great point. I think that's something we all struggle with, even when you want consensus within your own team. Maybe it's not even a lot of people, right? So it's a great point. It's something that I think we all need to continue to kind of work on. Moving on to Mariana.
It was along those lines. I think it's two or three elements are really key. One is ask first. So recognize that this is a negotiation. Like we all talk about collaboration and getting together, but it's really a negotiation among people with different interests and level of powers. And recognizing that and cater or try to, I don't know in English, cater or emphasize, put more effort to make sure the voices of those who have less power have a louder voice. And this is about asking, what is it that people want, need, can do, can commit? The second thing is clarity. if you set clear rule of the game from the beginning, if people don't like it, they may contest it, they may renegotiate it. But if you don't set this clarity from the beginning, then there's no conversation possible. And the third thing is the adaptive management perspective or the learning process. If you can agree to something and say, we will test for a year and then we'll see, and with clear rules, you can then modify. So I think these three things are important. No? Asking, clarity, clear rules, and being able to adapt.
Thank you. I mean, I can clearly say that you're really talking through about this from experience, the negotiations you're going through as part of your current project. So absolutely, I think the inclusivity aspect of multi-stakeholder data governance is so important, getting the voices of people who are generally marginalized, giving them a platform to be heard. And I think this is also, something that's being debated even at the global level between countries, low and middle income countries being better represented in global discussions. So really point well taken, Mariana. I want to move again now to Stefan and then Victor for their final thoughts on this.
Yeah, very brief. And again, I agree with everything that was mentioned before, so no need to repeat that. But I think one thing that I do want to leave behind is that quite often when we talk about multi-stakeholder governance approaches, we quite often grab back to approaches that originate in a previous era. And I think we can actually innovate also how we go about multi-stakeholder governance. And I've been in many multi-stakeholder governance environments, which was like, meaning what year are we in, right? Meaning we are in 2021, we should be able to do this also in a different way beyond always, anyways, having the kind of, and I'm not saying they are better or worse. I do think that we need to basically think in terms of how do we innovate and leverage the tools that we have today to govern, not only looking at what were the tools of yesterday. And that includes also, by the way, data science, right? For instance, if you want to have an understanding on power symmetries, well, can we actually use data science also for instance, network mapping or having kind of an understanding on what are the stakeholders associated with regard to a topic area? I mean, quite often when we do multi-stakeholder governance, we forget that we actually can use data to understand how to design multi-stakeholder governance and also feed the multi-stakeholder governance with data, for instance, as well. And I think we need a lot more experimentation of new ways of doing this. And as I said, I would be the last one to say, because it's new, it's better. But I do think that we need to push the boundaries a little bit of how to go about this, leveraging tools that we have today, and especially as a result, broadening actually those that can participate beyond the ones that can show up on a physical place, for instance, as well.
Thanks for giving us that kind of push, saying that don't get complacent, just let's get creative, innovate, and let's use some of the technologies at our disposal. Great point, Stefan. Just making notes of all of that. And Victor, your final thoughts.
Yeah, and I do agree with Stefan. I think following the textbook definition in some climes and instances can be hugely difficult. It requires a lot of innovation. In fact, there are places where we're pointedly told that that multi-stakeholder model would not work for us because of the power that's been arrogated. So it's important to understand the context, the issue, the interest of the institutions, the lead institution and the people, as this can create that huge power imbalance, which makes it difficult to advance such a model. If anyone has ever advanced the issue of national spatial data infrastructure at the country level, it's hugely political. There's a huge power tension around that particular topic. So that's one thing I want to note here. So it behoves us to listen and pretty much also be guided from the ground level. And then the second also around the fact that this model quite really are good, and they extend beyond just consultations and engagement, but also has helped to put in place very robust, sustainable processes and solution outcomes that pretty much pulled, the problem owners into the co-creation process in itself. And that's pretty much empowering and create a sustainable environment most often. But it comes with its own challenges as well. Of course, there are trade-offs. The huge, political, power struggle that you often see creates tensions, and if these things are not well managed, it could derail the entire objective of the whole, process. So finally, quick wins can be tough to extract, really, and we're all quick to extract something very, immediate to show that this is the result. This process requires a lot of time investments. So thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this. Yeah.
Fantastic, Victor. Thank you so much. I mean, for always keeping us practical, right? Let's define rules, take into account what's, the current political or the process environment and countries are, and, navigate around that. So this is really a really fantastic discussion, just hearing all these different examples. I do want to just maybe make one final, I really don't want to summarize. You've all really summarized this for me. Thanks for doing my job in today's event. But I do want to add one final point about that we again talk about in the report, is that, for me, the multi-stakeholder data governance is also about changing people's mindsets, kind of bringing them along and making them think about the importance and value of data and what it means to each individual. It may mean different things, as many of you said, but also changing the mindset of all the stakeholders. And for that, I think another important fundamental requirement or foundational requirement is data literacy, just educating people more about what this, what data means, and how does it apply in their daily lives, and how can they participate in these discussions with a purpose, and and have purposeful engagement. So I just wanted to kind of make those 2 points about changing mindsets and improving data literacy of our stakeholders, so we can have more meaningful participation. And I do want to also stress the point that Stefan brought about innovating and making multi-stakeholder data governance actually work for data, which might be different from the other other areas that we've typically dealt with. I hope we will continue to have more discussions and dialogues, and I'm super keen to follow what all of you are going to be doing. And particularly, I want to thank our participants and audience who stayed with us. I mean, a lot of people are still there, logged on for 90 minutes, so that just shows the interest in this area. And final thanks to Jana, Slaughton, and Martina from our Global Partnership for Sustainable Development team for co-hosting this event with us. Thank you, and have a great evening, afternoon, morning, everyone.